Who the hell can wait till morning? Talk now at latenightsportsradio.com.
It's the fantasy football playoffs. Hopefully you are still relevant in fantasy football. I'm sure you're relevant in life, folks. This is Keith Grieve from 87sportsfans.com, and this is the Fantasy Greek starts and sits in 60 minutes, the Week 15 edition. Joining me, as always, is the Fantasy Greek himself, Jim Sarantias. How are you, Jim? Welcome. Happy Wednesday.
Keith, happy Wednesday to you. How are you?
Oh, I am fantastic. But despite being knocked out rather unceremoniously in our league. The playoffs.
I didn't even notice.
I got thumped. It's one of those weeks where none of your own players hit and everybody on the team that you're playing hits.
Yeah.
It was just my pride. I'll be okay.
It'll happen in a 16-team league, though. I mean, that could happen. So, but you had a good run.
Hey, to make the playoffs after being tortured through auto draft, I take it as a major accomplishment. But it's just me. The only thing missing is the major award, the leg lamp showing up in the crate from Italy. But that's just me.
When you get a chance, send me your check, okay?
Oh, yes, of course. The tax man always cometh.
That's right.
All right, folks, for the 15th time this season, we will go through each matchup in the NFL schedule, and Jim will impart you with his knowledge as far as who stands to have a pretty good week fantasy-wise. If you have any specific lineup questions you would like us to address, the phone number is 585-633-7487. That's 585-633-7487. Or hit us up on Twitter. Just use the hashtag AskTFG. If you're listening to this on demand and not live, you can still hit the hashtag there, and Jim will get back to you in a timely manner. This is a very interesting week. We've got Thursday games. We've got Saturday games for the first time this season. And so the winter football is starting to come back. The holidays are next week, starting next week. It's time to make sure we do our part for you, because we do it for you, to have as cheery a holiday season and bring home that fantasy championship. So without further ado, let's head up with the first matchup. It's the Tampa Bay Buccaneers at the St. Louis Rams. The 6-7 Bucs and the 5-8 Rams. The Buccaneers losing to the Saints at home, a game I thought they could have won, but lo and behold, Drew Brees went and threw for 312 yards on him and a couple of touchdowns. For the Buccaneers, Jameis Winston humbled, only 18 of 32 for 182 yards and a touchdown. Doug Martin, 81 yards and a score. For the Rams last week, beating the Lions, try to figure out either one of those teams this year, and I'll wish you the best of luck. The Rams over the Lions, 21-14. Case Keenum, only 124 yards and no touchdowns. Todd Gurley, the story here, 140 yards on the ground on 16 carries and 2 touchdowns. So who's going to win this week? I have no idea which teams are going to show up here. You look at the numbers and you try to make an assumption here. The Buccaneers seem to have more of a semblance of an offense than the Rams have had, despite Todd Gurley having a fantastic season once he got going. And the Buccaneers play decent enough defense. I don't believe in the Rams. I think they're a mess. The Buccaneers are at least directionally pointed in the right direction. I'm going to take the Buccaneers on the road in this game.
Keith, this is one of these games that on the fantasygreek.com I do a winners table that lists all the games, all the winners, and confidence points for all our subscribers that happen to be in those office pools or want my input on how I think these games will turn out and sort of where they land in terms of level for whatever reason. For our purposes, I'm taking the Rams, but I hardly have. I think this is a really tough game to call. If I were a betting man, I would stay away from this game. And there's really the big reason for it is the Buccaneers should have won last week, and they didn't, and that really bothers me. And now to go on the road in St. Louis, they're coming off a win. Casey Keenum just has one more game under his belt in their offense with their personnel. Todd Gurley should have a huge game here. Doug Martin should have a good game as well. So I'm gonna take the Rams at home. From a fantasy perspective, this week we're all going to be focused on. We're right now trying to help people who already have good teams win games. So the only real fantasy players to be talking about here are Mike Evans, who I think is an wide receiver too. Vincent Jackson won't be in the lineup, so he's going to get targeted heavily. He is a must start this week. You've got to go with Doug Martin against a Rams rush defense that's been struggling, giving up 115 yards per game, 70 rush TDs on the season, the 10th most fantasy points. You can go ahead and get him started. He's a solid RB1. And then you've got to start Todd Gurley up against the Buccaneers team that, while pretty good defensively, they've been struggling, and Gurley's been playing at a high level. He's going to get the touches, and the Rams are going to give him some opportunities. So I like him this week. And as I said, I'm taking the Rams at home.
The Jets at the Cowboys. The Jets sitting at 8-5, and the Cowboys at 4-9. Yes, Matt Castle is at the helm yet again, and therefore the Cowboys' offense went bye-bye. Green Bay beating them last week 28-7. The Jets, on the other hand, hosted the Titans and laid the smackdown, the proverbial smackdown there. Fitzmagic going for 263 yards and 3 touchdowns. Brandon Marshall breaking the century mark in a score. Chris Ivory even eclipsed the century mark on the ground, however, did not find the end zone. McFadden for the Cowboys was the lone bright spot. 9 rushes and broke the century mark. That's just fantastic. But the Cowboys just don't have a lot going for them, and the Jets' defense is as good as advertised. First against the run, 19th against the pass in yardage, and 10th in scoring. That's just going to be too much for the Cowboys' offense. It just doesn't have the firepower without Tony Romo under center. Matt Castle just cannot get it done. I'm taking the Jets on the road.
Yeah, Keith, I don't know how you cannot take the Jets in this matchup. The Cowboys, they're a team that's under Matt Castle struggling to break 15 points per game, and it just hurts them. And now they're going up against a defense which is number 1 against the rush. They've been better against the pass, and only as of late have they struggled. But I still sort of look at it, and I see an underwhelming Cowboys offense that's going to have a tough time. And with that, it's difficult to start any one of your Cowboys, including Darren McFadden. I've got Des Bryant as sort of a low-end wide receiver 3. He hasn't impressed with Matt Castle under center. I think you're taking a huge risk playing him this week. More than likely, if you have him on your team, you've made it this far, you've got some pretty good wide receivers, and that you can more than likely play ahead of him. So I would stick with what got you through the season without Des Bryant this week. I wouldn't touch Jason Witten. I've seen people talk about him. He's, future Hall of Famer and blah, blah, blah. And yet he's not cutting it. I mean, I think he's had double-digit fantasy points just once in the last 3 or 4 weeks. I mean, it's really just not good. And then Darren McFadden's going up against the number 1 rush defense. He certainly makes for an RB2. I would say a low RB2. If you were lucky enough to get him after Joseph Randle, that means you've got some other running backs in the stable with McFadden. And this might be a good week to go with those guys instead of him. But if you have to go with him, keep your fingers crossed. He's going to be the key offensive producer for the Jets. Some people are really high on Ryan Fitzpatrick. He was mentioned in some waiver reports I saw as a guy to get, and you could stream in general for the playoffs, and I agree with that. And he's been very successful, about 240 to 280 yards and roughly 2 TDs per game in the last several weeks. But this is a good Cowboys pass defense. I would try and shy away from Fitzpatrick if I could. If you had to pick him up and he's the guy you've been rolling with these last few weeks and he's gotten you here, well, that's what you're going with. And then as far as position players, I think you kind of got to start them all. Brandon Marshall, Eric Decker, they're both players that are easily good for 100 receiving yards and 1 TD apiece. Chris Ivory is a must-start against the Cowboys' rush defense that you saw what Eddie Lacy did to him last week. It was about 125 yards rushing, 1 TD. That is a position they've struggled defending the entire season. They're number 15 against them in the league. Bilal Powell has come on as a receiving down back, and I think you can flex him if you need him, and definitely start the Jets defense against Matt Castle. I mean, like I said, they're struggling to get 16 points. I think he's throwing 150, 200 yards passing. Last week they gave him a couple sacks, an interception. When it all comes together, it's a top 10 performance for your defense. Start the Jets. Jets win.
The 8-5 Chiefs travel to the 4-9 Baltimore Ravens. Jimmy Clausen stands to be under center yet again, as according to ProFootballReference.com. Matt Schaub is still listed as questionable due to concussion-like symptoms. So either way, it doesn't really matter. You'll have a different level of ineptness, with Clausen being slightly worse than Schaub, depending on the injury, the health there. They got blown away by the Seahawks. But hey, Clausen was able to throw for 274 yards this time, as for the last time he faced the Seahawks this season when he was a member of the Bears, and barely could get it over the 50-yard mark, if I remember correctly. The Chiefs beat the Chargers 10-3 in a division game, closely guarded division game. Alex Smith didn't do anything more than he's asked to do, 191 yards and a touchdown. Albert Wilson leading with the receiving yards, 87 yards through the air, and a score. Charkandrick West, only 54 yards, no touchdowns. So the Ravens are a little bit of a mess, but they do present some kind of challenge here to the Chiefs. They are holding their opponents to under 100 yards rushing on the ground, and I believe for the Chiefs to be successful, they have to get it going on the ground. Spencer Ware is listed as, where did he go, questionable with ribs right now. Charkandrick West is a little nicked up. Last week they used them kind of as almost 50-50 split in the backfield. If the Chiefs can't run the ball, that puts all the pressure on Alex Smith. And that's where the Ravens fall apart, because they are not very good against the pass. And while Alex Smith is not going to light any kind of passing game on fire ever, against a defense as good as the Bills a couple weeks ago, he managed to push the ball downfield pretty good. I was impressed. It's good enough for me. The Chiefs' defense is still legit. I'm going to take the Chiefs on the road here.
Yeah, it's hard not to take the Chiefs right now, who defensively are dominating. And they have been for the last several weeks, close to 2 months, against a Ravens team that's just falling apart, really the victim of numerous injuries. And there's, at some point, the next man up is just not good enough. So where the Chiefs are going to set themselves apart is what you pointed out, Keith, in the passing game. The Ravens are giving up about 250 yards passing per game, an easy diet of 2 pass TDs per game, which for Alex Smith, that's pretty good. So he is a definite option this week. He will be one of the Fantasy Greek stardoms if you don't have somebody ranked higher than him. You're going to start Jeremy Maclin. Charkandrick West, it's definitely a tougher matchup because the Ravens can be so good defending the rush. But if Spencer Ware is out, Charkandrick West really takes over that Jamal Charles role, and he won't just be running the football. He'll be catching the football out of the backfield. So long as Spencer Ware is out, I like Charkandrick West to jump up sort of as a high RB2 this week, with a lot of upside if you got him. If Spencer Ware is active, then I would downgrade him, and hopefully you have a second option you can play ahead of him. Travis Kelce, he is actually going to be my sit of the week for tight ends in 8, 10, and 12-team leagues. There's just enough tight ends out there that are pretty darn good, and the Ravens are number 1, number 2, number 3, something like that against the tight end position. And you know what? Travis Kelce in 3 of the last 4 games has been awful. Just terrible. So I think if you want to get out of this week, he's a player that you should avoid if you can. And you should have a few options on the waiver wire, which you can also check out at thefantasygreek.com. For Ravens players, Javorius Allen and Kamar Aiken are the only 2 worth considering. Aiken's more of a low-end RB2 because the Chiefs' rush defense has been pretty darn good, allowing just 92 yards rushing per game, as well as just 6 touchdowns on the season. So keep that in mind when you set your roster. And then Kamar Aiken, wide receiver 3. I mean, his value is really sort of up for grabs between Jimmy Clausen and Matt Schaub. I like his chances better with Matt Schaub. But, I think you'll have other options than Kamar Aiken if he's even on your team. Take the Chiefs in this one, and I have got pretty good confidence in that.
All right, the Houston Texans travel to the Indianapolis Colts. Both teams sitting at 6-7. To complicate matters here for the Texans, Brian Hoyer is listed as doubtful exiting last game with a concussion, a game which saw the Texans fall to the Patriots 27-6. Hoyer did lead the way, though, 155 yards passing before the injury. DeAndre Hopkins with only 52 yards through the air. Jonathan Grimes, the leading rusher, with 53 yards on the ground. Obviously, no scores for anyone. The Colts, last time we saw them, they were getting blown out by the Jaguars, 51-16. Matt Hasselbeck, 18 of 35 for 252 yards. T.Y. Hilton, the $132, no scores, and Frank Gore leading the rushing game with 60 yards and no score. So, how do we pick this? Well, do you believe in T.J. Yates against the Indianapolis Colts passing defense? Yes, absolutely, I do, and the Colts are one of the only teams that I would say that about. He will not be the difference here. He won't be the problem. The question is whether the Texans can manage to score any points at all. I mean, honestly, they are just been one of those teams stuck in a rut, and I can't harp on it enough. Not drafting Teddy Bridgewater when they had the chance will set this franchise back farther than anybody will be willing to admit. But that's for another time. Their defense is good enough. They're not lights out. They're not putting anybody away by any stretch of the imagination. Their defense is good enough, and I think Matt Hasselbeck has shown some warts the last couple weeks. And he's listed as probable with a rib injury. But I think that the Texans' defense is good enough to go on the road and still win this because Andrew Luck is still listed as questionable with that lacerated kidney, which I would be highly questionable with a lacerated kidney as well. So I'm not judging by any stretch of the imagination. I'm taking the Texans in this game.
Keith, I am too, and I think you've highlighted all the points of why the Texans are such a good play. Their defense is the big part of this. I think T.J. Yates is actually not going to be bad. He and DeAndre Hopkins showed a lot of chemistry. He's going to be able to hit the other wide receivers. This is a Colts defense that has flashed, but eventually over games just falls apart. And that's not good. Matt Hasselbeck has done more than show warts. He's getting beat up, and the Texans are going to be out for him. This is a tough divisional game, and the Texans finally woke up these last couple of weeks, so I like their chances this week. From a fantasy perspective, I already mentioned DeAndre Hopkins. He remains a must-start. I believe he had a slightly better than 150 yards receiving the last time Yates was under center, so keep him active and make the Texans' defense a top 10 option this week, so you can start him if you need him. For the Colts, Frank Gore remains an RB2. T.Y. Hilton, he's the main guy for Matt Hasselbeck, and you can keep viewing him as a solid RB wide receiver to start this week. Dante Moncrief is not expected to play or has actually been ruled out, one of the two. Either way, don't even count on him this week. If you're desperate, you can go get Andre Johnson and pick him up and play, but I would sort of, other than for that reason, being desperate and no one else out there, I would still avoid him because who knows what Matt Hasselbeck is going to do. Outside of that, this is simple. Keith, Texans win.
The Atlanta Falcons travel to the Jacksonville Jaguars. The Falcons are disappointing, 6-7. The Jaguars is somewhat encouraging, 5-8. Go figure how that works. Because football. The Falcons absolutely shut out in Carolina last week, 38-0. If you cannot take this team seriously if they can't put up a point in a game. I know Carolina's good. Carolina's been fantastic. But if you got a quarterback that like Matt Ryan, where everyone says that he's this, he's that, you cannot be shut out in any game. I don't care who you're playing. Matt Ryan threw for 224, no scores. Julio Jones 88 yards. Devontae Freeman 40 yards on 12 carries and no scores, obviously. For the Jaguars, like just briefly talked about with the last matchup, they destroyed the Colts 51-16. Blake Bortles 250 yards and 3 touchdowns. Allen Hurns 3 catches for a $105 and a score. And Denard Robinson 75 yards and found the end zone himself. This is a game about momentum. When you're trying to pick this game, if you're looking at who's hot, who's not, it's clearly in the Jaguars' favor here, and I'm going to go with that route. Their defense. This might be a game where Matt Ryan throws 2 to 3 touchdowns Devontae Freeman has another fantastic week, like we saw earlier in the season. Although the Jaguars don't defend the run all that much, but the Jaguars can score some points, and they've shown that. And I don't believe in the Falcons secondary at all. I'm going to take Jacksonville at home in this game.
Yeah, I have to too. And it's the weirdest thing on paper. This is not such a bad matchup for the Falcons until you actually see how they've performed over the last several games. When you do that, you look at Matt Ryan and you go, oh my God, this might be a top 10 fantasy start from a fantasy points allowed perspective. But what confidence can you have in a player that I think in his last 5 games, 3 of those games he's thrown just 1 TD, and 1 of those games last week, 0 TDs? No. If you have him on your team and you saw, oh my God, they're top 10, no, don't do it. Go with your other guy. I mean, there's just nothing to be confident about here from a fantasy perspective as far as Matt Ryan is concerned. Julio Jones is obviously still a guy that you can play because he's going to get thrown the football and he can make some noise. So if he can put up 100, 150 yards and or a touchdown, he's a worthwhile play for you. Devonta Freeman, you got to look at him as an RB1. I know he has not played well the last several weeks. I was reminded about that earlier today by a caller who was comparing him to Denard Robinson. And but I think you have to view him as a guy because he's a running back that can get back on track. And there's nothing about this matchup that says, oh, don't start him against the Jaguars who are giving up the 15th most fantasy points to opposing running backs, okay? For the Jaguars, they're hot. I mean, just hot. As you pointed out, Keith, you're starting Blake Bortles. The firm of Allen and Allen Robinson, Allen Hearns, Julius Thomas makes for a top 6-7 start, and Denard Robinson is a solid RB2 with RB1 upside. I like the Jaguars this week, Keith. Roar Jaguars. Go, baby. Go.
All right, the Chicago Bears travel to the Minnesota Vikings, the 5-8 Bears, the 8-5 Vikings. The Redskins beating the Bears at home last week, which should surprise no one. The Bears are 1-6 at home this year. It's god awful. The Vikings, on the other hand, losing a nail biter to the Cardinals last Thursday night, 23-20. Teddy Bridgewater goes for 335 and a score. Adrian Peterson held to 69 yards and 23 rushes by the top-notch Cardinals defense, but did manage to find the end zone. Kyle Rudolph leading the way for the Vikings with 67 yards receiving. For the Bears, Jay Cutler, 19-31 for 315 yards and 2 touchdowns and his prerequisite strip sack fumble. Alshon Jeffrey, 107 yards and a score. Matt Forte, only 45 yards, but did find the end zone. The Bears are an enigma. The Vikings seem to have it all coming together here, kids. And while they're not world beaters yet at this stage of the game, you definitely see light at the tunnel with the Vikings. Where at the Bears, you see that light, and at least this year anyway, it's a train. This team very well could be 9-2. They're 4 out of their 8 losses are that bad, that close, that winnable. It's got to be sitting. It should be churning stomachs in Chicago. But the Vikings are going to win this game.
Keith, I'm with you. The Bears they're really playing for next season. And so far, there's a lot of question marks. We know their defense isn't too bad. At least their defensive coordinators able to take the talent they have on the field and put a good defense out there, but their offense is struggling. You can't win a football game in the NFL if you can't score over 22, 24 points on average, and they're not doing that. Against the Vikings, who have a great defense, what's really going to be important for them is to get healthy. They were missing Linval Joseph in their last game, Anthony Barr, Harrison Smith, strong safety Andrew Sendejo. If these guys come back, I think it's pretty much a done deal. The Bears are going to go to Minnesota, and they're going to get whooped. From a fantasy perspective, you're going to like Alshon Jeffrey. You're going to like Matt Forte. You're going to like Zach Miller, who actually had a pretty decent game last week. I think he had 80-some yards receiving. All 3 of them should do enough fantasy-wise to be worthwhile plays. The key will be who can get in the end zone. Certainly Matt Forte is the best candidate for that. On the flip side, the Vikings, Adrian Peterson is a must-start. After him, it's really hard to find anybody else worth liking. The Bears' deep pass defense has been so good. Even Stephon Diggs is not the greatest of starts. I literally have him as a very, very, very low wide receiver 3 probably is better as a flex play. I'd avoid Kyle Rudolph at this point in the season. Certainly start the Vikings defense. This should be a great matchup for them if they're healthy. Vikings at home.
I said they could be 9-2. I meant 9-4. I didn't want to interrupt you with my correction, but it was bothering me while you were talking.
Okay.
And now I got it out and I feel better. So the Tennessee Titans travel to the New England Patriots. 3-10 Titans, 11-2 Patriots. Look, the Titans show fight when necessary, but at other times they just look lost, and they look lost against the Jets last week. 30-8 was the defeat. Mariota, 274 yards, no scores. Delaney Walker, 71 yards, no scores. The leading rusher for the Titans was Dexter McCluster. He had 12 yards. That was the leading rusher for the Titans. That simply is a recipe for disaster. You have to be able to provide some kind of run game, unless you are the Patriots, who just don't have any desire to run the ball at all. They're a team that actually averages less yards per game than on the ground than the Titans. But they have this guy named Brady. I don't know if you've heard of him, and this other guy, Gronkowski. Brady last week went for 226 and 2 scores, and Gronkowski 87 yards and a touchdown. LeGarrette Blount rushed for 53 yards, but he has been lost for the season. Hip injury, but that he will be done for the rest of the year. So you're looking at this game, like the Titans would be a nice story, a nice upset story, with the rookie quarterback and everything. It's just not going to happen, kids. The Patriots are favored by 14, and I think that's a comfortable margin.
Yeah, the Patriots will win this game. Obviously, Patriots, you're starting Tom Brady, you're starting Danny Amendola, Robert Gronkowski. Start their defense against the rookie. They should be throwing everything they have at him. And while I don't necessarily think Marcus Mariota will struggle at times, he games up some success, but not enough to be a worthwhile fantasy play. If you picked up Brandon Bolden this week, you might as well start him. He, without question, is the starting running back of the Patriots. He had 16 carries to James White's 1 carry. White was more involved in the passing game. I think he only had 4 passes. Ultimately, in fantasy, he wasn't much of a factor. So Brandon Bolden's the guy to start as an RB2 if you picked him up this week and need the help. Other Titans you might consider, Antonio Andrews is a running back. Isn't bad. He's definitely a low RB2 this week. High RB3, depending what your other options are. And Delaney Walker, you got to play him. The guy gets targeted 8 to 12 times a game. He's their number one receiver. And while the Patriots will throw all they have at him, I just cannot picture a single cornerback that could handle or manhandle a guy of his size and his girth. Keep starting Delaney Walker. Patriots win.
The Carolina Panthers, the still undefeated Panthers, go to the New York Giants. 6-7 for the Giants, and a nice win last week, 31-24 over the Dolphins. Eli Manning for 337 and 4 touchdowns. Odell Beckham Jr. just continues his ridiculous first 2 seasons in the NFL. 166 yards on 7 catches, 2 touchdowns, and he did that missing a good portion of the third quarter. Needing to get IV hydration because he was fighting an illness. And he still went for 166 yards and 2 touchdowns, including that ridiculous toe-dragging catch that was all over social media. The Panthers, like I said before, shut out the Falcons at home 38-0. The Panthers are just downhill on roller skates right now and just gaining momentum going forward, and they're doing everything pretty good. They don't pass the ball much because they don't really need to. They run the ball with Jonathan Stewart, who went for 75 yards and a touchdown last week, but is listed as questionable to play with a foot injury. So who's going to step up there? The money would be placed on, as I call up their depth chart while I'm talking to you, Fozzie Whitaker. If you can put your faith in a man named Fozzie, more power to you. Just kidding. They're going to run the ball, and they're going to run the ball well. The Giants, on the other hand, don't defend the pass all that well. So this might be a game where we see Cam Newton put the ball in the air and throw for 3 or 4 scores like we've seen him be able to do. The Giants, though, you got to be careful here because they're plus 10 in takeaway differential. So if there's a mistake to be made by Cam Newton, the chances are the Giants will take advantage of it. This game is in New York. It's going to be a very interesting matchup here. But I'm telling you, Carolina is just in a groove right now, and I'm not picking against them until they give me a reason not to. I'm taking the Panthers.
Yeah, absolutely. The Panthers are the number one team in football right now, and the one team I think that could arguably beat the Patriots because they've just found ways to win games, whether it be the running game one week, their passing game another week, their defense on a different week. Somehow this team wins football games by any means necessary. For fantasy, Cam Newton remains a top 5 start. Greg Olsen remains a top start. Ted Ginn is a great start this week. I've got him as a high-end wide receiver 3 with certainly wide receiver 2 upside. Last week's 2 reception, 120-yard, and 2 TD game. Consider that sort of a fluke. Ginn's does his best work against teams that give up a bunch of fantasy points and are weak in defending the pass, and that's exactly what the Giants are, giving up 308 yards per game, the most in the NFL, and 23 TDs on the season. So you go ahead and you get Ted Ginn started. He should be an absolute good play. His numbers reflect that. Panthers DST must start every single week. For the Giants, Odell Beckham Jr. has got a really tough matchup here with Josh Norman admittedly going to be covering him. But the reality is Odell Beckham Jr. is one of the best athletes in the NFL at his position, and you've got to come out and be that special something to stop this guy. And so far, nobody's done that. So go ahead and start Odell Beckham Jr. as a wide receiver 1 this week with confidence. Is he going to have to fight? Yes. Could he be held out of the end zone? Sure. But I think he'll put together a nice body of work. It won't be his best, but it'll still be worthy of the start. Will Ty is certainly an option at tight end. Hopefully you don't have to go to him. But he is an option if you need the help. But I got to think if you made it this far, he's not your guy, which is just fine. Eli Manning, hey, on again, off again. Fantastic game last week. Bad game before. If you have one of our other stardoms, I would consider that this week. But if Eli Manning's been your guy and got you here, hey, go ahead and roll with them. The one thing that I think is absolutely true about this game is for the Giants to be in it, they've got to throw it. And because of that, that makes Eli Manning and Odell Beckham Jr. and a guy like Will Ty worthwhile plays. Jonathan Stewart will not play this week. Fozzie Whitaker would be the guy to take over, but I think it's going to be a combination of him, Mike Tolbert at the goal line. Cameron Artis-Payne is going to get some work. If it were me, I would stay away from the situation in terms of the running backs, despite the fact that this is an incredibly favorable matchup for the Panthers runners. Panthers win, Keith.
The Arizona Cardinals travel to the Philadelphia Eagles. The Cardinals sitting at 11-2. The Eagles at 6-7. Cardinals beating the Vikings last week 23-20. Carson Palmer goes for 310 and 2 scores. Michael Floyd breaking the century mark with a score. David Johnson 92 yards on the ground, but no touchdowns. The Eagles squeaking out a win over the Bills. So Chip Kelly avoids the embarrassment of having to look LaShawn McCoy in the eye. Sam Bradford goes for 247 and a touchdown. Zach Ertz 98 yards. Darren Sproles 41 yards on the ground and a touchdown to lead the Eagles' rushing attack. The Cardinals are, second in scoring offense, 7th in scoring defense, 3rd in passing yards per game, the 10th in rushing yards per game. The Eagles, conversely, are 21st against or 24th against the pass defensively and 28th against the run. That's pretty much all you're really going to need to know here, kids. The Cardinals are just a much better team. And while the Eagles might surprise and might make me eat my words, I'm saying Arizona wins this game comfortably.
Yeah, you hit the high points on the Cardinals' offense. This is an Eagles defense, which last week finally showed up. But that definitely gives you no faith in the kind of performance they're going to put in this weekend. Carson Palmer, to me, is the number 1 start this week against an Eagles team, giving up just about 260 passing yards per game, 29 TDs on the season. So that guarantees him 2 TDs. Certainly, I think he's good for 3. So you're starting Carson Palmer. Michael Floyd will be the top wide receiver in the bunch to start as a high-end wide receiver 2. Then John Brown is sort of a lower-end wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3. Then Larry Fitzgerald sort of is a high wide receiver 3, low wide receiver 2. You can get all those guys active. David Johnson is a must-start running back easily because the Eagles have been just terrible defending the rush, giving up the 5th most rushing yards in the league, 12th most fantasy points. So that means he's going to make some noise catching the football and running for some yards after the catch. The only Eagle, in my opinion, worthwhile, even remotely considering, is going to be Darren Sproles. And even then, I think that's a shaky play. That whole backfield is just a mess. And from a fantasy perspective, if you've made it this far with any one of those 3 guys, I'm applauding you because they've been so inconsistent and so unpredictable this year. And Chip Kelly has made such a mess of things that it's hard to give a strong recommendation as to any of them. Avoid Sam Bradford. Jordan Matthews, he's always a wide receiver 3, but hopefully you have somebody that's more a sure thing. But if he's your wide receiver 3, then roll with him if you must. Zach Ertz has made some noise, but again, at this point in the season, he could bust just as easily as have another 90-yard game. I'd avoid Ertz for sure. Cardinals defense must start. Cardinals win.
The Buffalo Bills travel to the Washington Redskins, both teams sitting at 6-7. The Redskins riding high after going on the road and getting their first road win of the season against the Bears, 24-21. On a game that the Bears probably could have won for a couple different reasons, but they went out and did what they had to do. Kirk Cousins throwing for 300 yards. Jordan Reed breaking the century mark with a score. And Matt Jones, 62 yards, no scores on the ground. For the Bills, in what can only be deemed as a disappointing loss, not just because it was the Eagles and the whole Chip Kelly, LaShawn McCoy thing, but you're fighting for a playoff spot here, kids. And to go down there and to be leading going into the fourth quarter and to just kind of choke it away. I'm sorry, they were tied in the fourth quarter. They were leading late into the third, and to just kind of choke it away is just things that a playoff team just can't let happen. The Eagles are not world beaters. The Bills could have and should have probably won that game. That's a game they needed to win, and they just didn't for whatever reason. Tyrod Taylor, 19 of 36 for 268 yards. Robert Woods, 5 catches for 106 through the air, but no touchdowns. And LaShawn McCoy leading the rushing attack with 74 yards on 20 carries. So the Bills going to the Redskins. How do they match up? Well, the Bills are 13th in points scored and 15th in points allowed. The Redskins are 17th in points scored, 17th in points allowed. The defenses match up. Well, the Redskins play the pass a little bit better, and the Bills play the rush a little bit better than the Redskins do. So it's going to be a toss. I am just going to go with the home team here, kids. The Redskins beat the Bills and make Rex Ryan have to chase his tail in the media just a little bit more.
This is one of those games you look at, again, you can go a little bit either way. There's some positives to see on both teams, but the one thing I think that really helps the Redskins is the fact that they are very deeply involved in a playoff hunt, and they're playing at home. There's something to be said for that, and there's something to be motivational about that. All that said, from a fantasy perspective, there's not too many Redskins players you could confidently look at and say, oh yeah, you should be starting this player this week, whether it be Kirk Cousins, Alfred Morris, Matt Jones, Pierre Garçon, the Redskins defense, and Deshaun Jackson. Out of all of them, Deshaun Jackson's probably the only one to give some sort of faith and credit because he's their big play guy. When they need something to happen, they're going to go to him, and they'll probably need him on Thursday night. It helps that the Bills are definitely banged up in their secondary, so he won't get the best coverage in the world. And for the Bills, from a fantasy perspective, I like what they're doing. They could possibly do. Tyrod Taylor's a good play. LaShawn McCoy's a good play. Sammy Watkins is an outstanding play. And even Robert Woods is sort of a borderline wide receiver 3. But in the end, can they all collectively beat this Redskins team? That, I think, is a tough call on the road in what's going to be a hostile environment. Some way, somehow, the Redskins will put it together, and I'm going to take them at home. Redskins win.
The Green Bay Packers travel to the Oakland Raiders, the 9-4 Packers, and the 6-7 Raiders. The Raiders beating the Broncos 15-12 in a snooze fest and a half. Well, if you like defense, I guess you like that game, but 15-12, oof. Derek Carr goes for 2 touchdowns on 135 yards passing on 29 attempts. You do the math there, kids. Michael Rivera leading the way through the air for the Raiders, 49 yards and a score. Latavius Murray managed 27 yards on 16 carries. Yes, you read that right. Yeah, I know the Denver's defense is good and all, but geez, Oakland, figure it out. Yeah. The Packers 28-7 winners over the Cowboys. Aaron Rodgers, 218 yards and 2 scores. Randall Cobb, 81 yards and no scores. Eddie Lacy, 124 yards on 24 rushes and a touchdown as well. The Raiders are one of those teams where you all season long we wanted to declare they're back, and then they go out and lay an egg. The Packers play pretty well on the road. They're 4-2. The Raiders are only 2-4 at home, so the home field advantage doesn't even really play into this game at all. It's what do you think the matchup is going to be? And Aaron Rodgers against the 28th ranked passing defense bodes very well for the Packers. I'm going to take Green Bay.
I'm going to take Green Bay too. And this game really, I think this game could be a nice game for the quarterbacks, or it'll be a really nice game for the Raiders. The Raiders are a team that at home, they can play an opponent really tough. So I'm taking the Packers because you look at them and they've certainly got a prolific offense under Aaron Rodgers when things are going right, despite the fact that only recently does it seem like things are better. Aaron Rodgers is one of these guys, he's going to get you 2 TDs. Fantasy football, he's a must start. Eddie Lacy proved himself last week. There's nothing about this Raiders rush defense that should scare anybody. He should be good for 100 yards and score, keep him active. Randall Cobb, with Mike McCarthy calling the plays last week, they constructed plays for Randall Cobb. They want to get the football to Randall Cobb, and you want to keep him active as a wide receiver too this week. The Packers defense, I think, is a solid start. The greatest, no, but they're solid, meaning they're low end in a 10-team league, certainly solid in a 12, and even better in a 14 or a 16-team league. And I like Richard Rodgers. He's a candidate for a TD against a defense giving up the second most fantasy points to the position. He should make some noise and you can roll with him. For the Raiders, this is tricky. I like Derek Carr. He has struggled a little bit. He can throw for 2 TDs this week. That doesn't scare him, but is he going to get you to that 3? Is he really going to push that elite level? That's where I hesitate. So I sort of have him outside the top 10. But if he's the guy that got you here, especially after how he's played recently, then you keep starting him as usual. Latavius Murray makes for a solid RB2 against the defense giving up the 10th most yards to running backs. As well as almost 1 TD per game. He should have a solid outing. And this week, Amari Cooper and Michael Crabtree should make a little bit of noise, keep those guys active as wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3. I'm going to take the Packers at home on the road as well in a game I think that could be much closer than people will give it credit for.
The Browns travel to the Seattle Seahawks, 3-10. The Browns are sitting at the Seahawks, 8-5. The Browns beating the 49ers last week, 24-10. Johnny Manziel didn't look all that bad, 270 yards and a score. He did have that one god-awful interception where he rolled out to his left and then turned and threw across his body across the field. And, of course, that gets picked off in the NFL. Brian Hartline, 107 yards on the ground, but no score. Isaiah Crowell, 145 yards and 2 touchdowns. So if you were the guy that was banking on a Browns running back hitting and you picked Crowell, kudos to you. The Seahawks went into Baltimore and destroyed the Ravens 35-6. Russell Wilson, 292 yards and 5 touchdowns. Yes, that's right, 5 touchdowns. Tyler Lockett, 104 yards and 2 of those scores. Thomas Rawls, 44 yards. However, he's out for a broken ankle and will miss the rest of the season. So, what does that mean for the Seahawks running game? Well, I don't think it matters who they put back there because they're going to do what they do and they're going to run, and Fred Jackson steps up to the plate. Do you think that Fred Jackson can run decently behind this offensive line? I do. And the Browns this year have been 29th in the league against the run as far as yards surrendered. It's going to be a rough go in Seattle. Johnny looked nice and all, but again, that was the 49ers. Don't forget that. How he does against Seattle will be as much a barometer as where Johnny Manziel is in the NFL as anything. And I think Seattle wins this game pretty easily.
Last week, the Browns had a great showing, and they did it because they had a great running game. That will be non-existent this week. Isaiah Crowell won't get anywhere near the end zone. He won't even smell it. The Seahawks are number 2 against the rush, 83 yards allowed, 9 TDs on the season in fantasy. That equates to the number 1 rushing defense in fantasy football. And because of that, all the pressure will be on Johnny Manziel. And unfortunately, I think he's going to fall apart. I think he'll likely be good for a score. And in my mind, it's going to be to Gary Barnidge, who's the best fantasy play on the Browns. But outside of that, this is a Browns team that should get stomped, which means you're starting the Seahawks defense. On offense, Russell Wilson, 13 TDs, I think it is, in the last 3 games. I mean, it's really just crazy. Expect 3 to 5 TDs again this week because we're not sure what we're going to get out of the running game. In fact, I don't even think the Seahawks know what they're going to get out of their running game. So start Russell Wilson. Doug Baldwin he's a top 10 start this week. This guy has been on fire the last several weeks. So you make sure if he's on your team, you just keep on starting him without hesitation. Tyler Lockett is now a wide receiver 3. He's been heavily targeted the last 2 weeks, scored the 2 TDs last week. You got to like him as a really strong play. In terms of the running game, if I had my way, I wouldn't start a single Seahawks running back this week, despite the favorable matchup. However, if you had to go pick up Bryce Brown, likely you did it because you had Thomas Rawls and you couldn't get Denard Robinson and decided to pass on Brandon Bolden or couldn't get Brandon Bolden. But Pete Carroll has made it very clear that Fred Jackson is going to be their receiving running back, which means he'll have the minimal amount of touches. Not to say he won't do anything with them, but you can't gauge right now exactly what he's going to do from a fantasy perspective, so he's not a good play. Bryce Brown, on the other hand, started the week as a very strong play, a guy that could potentially get 2 touches every single 4 downs. Now, with the addition of Christine Michael today, you kind of got to wonder. I mean, they're saying that it's Bryce Brown's job to lose, but, you add another running back like Christine Michael who had been on the team before, and you kind of wonder, well, it's certainly not a secure job. So if you have Bryce Brown, he's the guy to go with if you had to replace Thomas Rawls and you got nothing else on your roster. Otherwise, avoid the situation. Nonetheless, Seahawks win. Let's move on.
The Denver Broncos travel to the Pittsburgh Steelers. 10-3 for the Broncos, 8-5 for the Steelers, but the Broncos losing a heartbreaker to the Raiders, 15-12. Brock Osweiler, 308 yards on 51 attempts. No touchdowns, 95 yards for Demaryius Thomas for the year on 10 catches. And Ronnie Hillman, the leading rusher for the Broncos, at 20 yards on 12 rushes. Just not going to get it done. The Steelers, on the other hand, in a game they absolutely had to win, and they put up a hell of a showing there, beating the Bengals 33-20. Yes, Andy Dalton was knocked out of the game with a thumb injury. But still, there was a game they had to go in and be physical, and they did. They mangled that game right out of the Bengals' hands. Roethlisberger goes for 282 yards, but no scores. Antonio Brown, 87 yards. D'Angelo Williams, 76 yards on 23 rushes and 2 touchdowns. We'll call that an economical outing from D'Angelo Williams. The Broncos, on the other hand, there's some concern, some question whether about where Peyton Manning is in his rehab. Is Brock Osweiler really the answer? And if looking at the injury report at Pro Football Reference right now, it's saying that Manning is still listed as out, so we'll be seeing another week of Brock Osweiler. For the Steelers, no real big additions to the injury report. And this is a team that needs to find some momentum because they are not in a position standings-wise to give up any ground the rest of the way. The Steelers are playing some decent football, and they just scored 33 points without Roethlisberger throwing a touchdown pass. So they're doing it in a variety of ways. I'm taking the Steelers at home.
I think it's hard to go against the Steelers for 2 reasons. The first reason is they can certainly put some points on the board, and despite going against their number 1 defense in the league, I mean, Ben Roethlisberger is capable of a 2 TD game, despite what I will say is a very tough matchup. Nonetheless, what makes it harder for the Broncos to win this game is Brock Osweiler in his 4 starts, I think it's 4 or 5. The Broncos on offense are averaging 16.6 points per game. And I just don't see that being enough to beat a team like the Steelers, whose defense can certainly step up. Now, from a fantasy perspective, for Broncos players, you want to like Brock Osweiler because the Steelers' pass defense is so bad. giving up 279 yards per game, second worst in the league. 25 TDs on the season. That's just about a steady diet of 2 TDs per game. But the problem is he has yet to throw a multi-TD game. He's been sacked, I think it's like 15 times in his 5 starts, a couple of interceptions. So none of that bodes well for him, and I would avoid him at all costs in fantasy. Demaryius Thomas, I like him as a start. He's the one receiver that he's had some chemistry with, along with Vernon Davis, while I'd like to recommend him, we've only seen one decent game from him, and we know Owen Daniels is not gone. It's just no guarantee of who's going to be the main guy for the coming week. And given what's on the line, I would avoid Vernon Davis. Emmanuel Sanders, hard to avoid, but if you have him, the last 2 games have not been good. If you've made it this far, I'm sure this game makes you nervous. But if you have him, I think you got to keep going with him, especially because of that matchup. For the Steelers, you got to stick with Big Ben. I mean, I know it's a tough matchup. It was a tough matchup for Tom Brady, and he had a pretty good game. So you're hoping for Big Ben to get you 200 to 230 yards and a couple of TDs. He's more of a lower QB1 in all formats. D'Angelo Williams remains a top 10 start. He's going to get the football. He's going to get opportunities to run. Antonio Brown keeps starting him despite the matchup. You don't need him to score a touchdown to have a good game. And his good game is going to be better than most of your receivers on your team anyway. Martavius Bryant is actually a very intriguing start because of the top coverage rolling over to Antonio Brown. So I definitely like Martavius Bryant as sort of a low-end wide receiver 2, high-end wide receiver 3. Keith Miller was heavily targeted last week. It's not a bad matchup on paper in terms of fantasy points allowed. He's probably not the best tight end on your team, and probably the best one, and you're going to roll with them instead of him. But if for some reason that's not the case, don't discount Miller, absolutely. And then I like the Steelers' defense this week, not just because of the possibility of winning the game, but for the stats I pointed out earlier, all the sacks that Osweiler gives up, the couple interceptions he's thrown. He gave up his first fumble last week. So there are certain things indicating this is a Steelers team that is in line for a top 10 finish, even though it may not be top 5, but it certainly is in the top 10, and that makes them worthwhile. I'm going to take the Steelers at home.
The Miami Dolphins travel to the San Diego Chargers, the 5-8 Dolphins, and the Chargers at 3-10. The Dolphins losing to the Giants 31-24, but for all intents, 36 yards through the air with a touchdown. Jarvis Landry 99 yards. Just one shy of if you play in a league of the 100-yard bonus threshold. So a little frustrating for fantasy owners there naturally, but Lamar Miller 89 yards on only 12 rushes, but 2 scores. And the Chargers last week losing to the Chiefs 10-3. Phillip Rivers 263 yards. Antonio Gates 76 yards. Melvin Gordon 35 rushes on 14 attempts. The Chargers are just a mess. I mean, how do you pick the Chargers in any matchup right now? The Dolphins are by no means perfect. In some instances, they're even worse than the Chargers. But right now, I don't like anything that the Chargers are doing. They held the Chiefs to 10 points. So you want to point to that as an uptick in the defense? No, they're still 27th in the league in points allowed. The Dolphins are 26th. But you know what? It's like I really don't know which angle to go. This is an ugly matchup because neither team is really very good. You want to pick the home team, but that's not good enough for me in this. So Phillip Rivers can throw all he wants, but what else are you going to do if you're one-dimensional? How are you going to score points? I mean, the Dolphins' defense isn't good, but can they keep them off the board long enough, or possibly outscore them? With a flawed offense that they have themselves. It's a complete toss-up. The Chargers are 27th in scoring defense. The Dolphins are 26th. The Chargers are 28th in scoring offense. The Dolphins are 24th. So who do you think is going to show up better here? It's just a complete gut pick. The Chargers are just lost. They're adrift. I'm taking the Dolphins here on the road.
And Keith, I'm going to take actually the Chargers at home. I really like not the fact that they lost last week, but they lost 10-3 to a dominating Chiefs team. I mean, the Chiefs should have just at home cleaned their clock, just shown them the door, kicked them. So don't let it hit you on the way out. And I mean, it should have been an ugly win or an ugly loss for the Chargers, and that's not what happened. And the Dolphins, on the other hand, were exposed last week to the Giants. I mean, they started off the game really strong and really nicely, and then defensively just fell apart. Eli Manning picked them apart. Odell Beckham Jr. picked them apart. Rashad Jennings, while not having a good fantasy game by any means, had a good game as just a running back for his age and in that offense. So I'm actually going to take the Chargers, and I think they're going to be mad enough. The Dolphins are making the commute from the East Coast to the West Coast. Are weak enough in their defense. Phillip Rivers, I think, is going to pick them apart. I think he's not a guy I would be confident in fantasy football because of the recent history. But I think at the end of the day, he's certainly in line for a couple TDs. Antonio Gaethje keeps starting him. He's certainly still a top 10 start. If you're going to play any of the running backs, this is a great matchup for the running backs, by the way, for both teams. So Lamar Miller is a start, RB2. Danny Woodhead, I can't call him an RB2, but I think he's a strong flex play. Would I rely on him in fantasy? Probably. It depends. It depends what my options were. Again, this is a week I don't want to take risks, but I like the matchup for him, and I even like the matchup for Malcolm Floyd. I mean, Floyd he made a few good plays last week, and this week those opportunities should present themselves plenty. For the Dolphins, Lamar Miller's a must-play. I think you've got to start Jarvis Landry if you have him. And as far as anybody else on that team, I would avoid him. I wouldn't trust Ryan Tannehill at this point. I mean, last week he should have had an outstanding game, and he had a very mediocre to below average game. And the Chargers holding the Chiefs to just 10 points, I can't trust him. I'm taking the Chargers.
All right, the Cincinnati Bengals travel to the San Francisco 49ers. And for the Bengals, bad news, Andy Dalton out for the rest of the regular season at least. So in steps A.J. McCarron. So for right now, we're momentarily going to travel back to 1987. The top grossing movie that year was The Princess Bride. The number one song was Poison, Talk Dirty to Me. You know what else happened in 1987? That was the last time an Alabama quarterback won an NFL game. Jeff Rutledge for the 1987 New York Giants. Go ahead, try to verify my data. It's accurate. But that being said, this 49ers defense is nothing to really worry about. They are 27th against the pass, 31st against the rush, and 19th in scoring defense. Yippee. A.J. McCarron came into a game that he wasn't expected to play in against a pretty decent Steelers defense and still went 22 of 32 for 280 yards and 2 touchdowns. So what can he do against San Francisco with a full week of preparation as the starter? Well, it remains to be seen because it goes both ways. The 49ers will be prepping for him as well. A.J. Green last week, 132 yards and a score. Giovanni Bernard, 40 yards, no scores. For the 49ers last week in a loss to the Browns, Blaine Gabbert, 194 yards and a touchdown. Blake Bell led the 49ers receiving corps with 49 yards. And Sean Drawn, 43 yards on 11 rushes and no scores. The Bengals, I believe, are going to allow A.J. McCarron to break this streak. And not because of anything A.J. McCarron is going to do. Their defense is legit, and San Francisco just doesn't have any offense. Blaine Gabbert's been a nice story. He's played decent. But there's just not enough there in San Francisco. I'm taking the Bengals.
Yeah, the Bengals manhandled the Steelers' offense last week, and I just cannot imagine how the 49ers' offense can do any better than the Pittsburgh Steelers. I'm taking the Bengals as well. You're starting their defense. You're definitely starting Jeremy Hill, who's a very strong RB2 going against the worst fantasy rush defense in the league, giving up around 25 fantasy points to the position. Don't hesitate to start Gio Bernard as a flex play if you absolutely need him. Keep A.J. Green active, Tyler Eifert if he's active this week. There's a genuine good possibility that he does not play, but keep A.J. Green active because A.J. McCarron did a nice job running the offense. I mean, he threw for 280 yards and a couple of TDs. Yeah, he had the picks, but, throwing interceptions, that can be corrected. Can't he throw the multi-TD game? He has proven that he can. I wouldn't start him this week because of the risk associated with a rookie, but that doesn't mean you can't play a guy like A.J. Green. And if you had to Marvin Jones as a flex play in deeper leagues. For the 49ers, there's no one really of interest to me except Sean Drone, and even then, I think he's a borderline RB2, only startable if you've got nobody better to play. The Bengals should win this game hands down.
All right, and our final matchup of the week, the Detroit Lions travel to the New Orleans Saints. The Lions, every time they take 2 steps forward, they end up taking 3 steps back afterwards. And again, last week, losing to the Rams 21-14 in St. Louis. Matt Stafford, 245 yards, 2 touchdowns. Golden Tate, 60 yards, and both of those scores. Joique Bell, 50 yards on 7 carries. And for the Saints, beating the Buccaneers on the road, Drew Brees goes for 312 yards and 2 touchdowns. Willie Snead, 122 yards, but did not find the end zone. And Tim Hightower, toting the ball, the what do you call it, the load bearing running back. I was trying to say water carrying. I kept trying to mix my metaphors there, and it came out really bad. 28 carries for 85 yards and a touchdown. Of note, a New Orleans running back had 28 carries last week. That just defies the odds there, because that's not typically how the Saints offense tends to run. The Lions have the ability to score points. We know this. They just don't seem to want to or be able to put it together at the right time. The Saints have the worst scoring defense, but the Lions haven't been able to take advantage or give you any hint that they'll be able to take advantage of such a porous defense in this game. This is going to be closer than anybody really wants to admit, because on paper, the Saints should be better because they should be able to just outscore everybody. But that hasn't really been the case. They're 11th in the league in points scored, but it's been a season of peaks and valleys for the Saints. No real consistent anything. If they're going to start giving a running back 28 carries and control the clock a little bit more, you might see a little different shift in that mentality. But I'm not going to take one game against the Buccaneers as a sign of a trend. They're the home team. I think this game is actually even though the Saints have played horrible defense. The Lions have been just as bad offensively, in my opinion. I'm going to take the Saints at home.
Me too, Keith. The big change here, in my mind, is Drew Brees. He has been on a roll with 3 of his last 5 games for over 250 yards, and with 4 of his last 5 games for 2 or more TDs. This is a Lions team which I will admit has had some pretty good defensive games, but Brees has done what he's been doing against average to good to medium. I mean, the defense doesn't matter. We're seeing some old-style Saints football, and with them pulling away as they have and getting a running back that can certainly make up the legroom of Ingram, I like their chances to win this game, especially at home on Monday Night Football. So you can start Brees this week as a low QB1. Certainly, Tim Hightower is a solid RB2 with some upside. What you have to hope happens here is exactly what happened last week, which is the Saints take a nice lead towards the end of the game, and what they do to run out the game is basically hand the football to the running back and run the clock out. So you're hoping for that to really give Tim Hightower that extra push. Start Ben Watson. He's a solid tight end play, just like he was last week, as I recommended. You can start Brandon Cooks. I'm a little more worried about him because I think he's going to draw the top coverage here. Some people are really high on him. I'm not so much. I'd rather start Willie Snead if it were up to me. At least the decision is more clear to me. Willie Snead is a wide receiver 3 with some upside, where you're looking at Cooks as sort of a wide receiver 2, and you're keeping your fingers crossed that, he'll hit those kinds of numbers. So if I could avoid him, I would. For the Lions, Matt Stafford against one of the worst pass defenses in the league, you got to start him. Calvin Johnson, you got to start him. Erica Brown has the number 1 matchup amongst all tight ends against a Saints defense giving up the most fantasy points to the position, and yet I would hesitate. He's usually good for about 5 receptions, and the question is, can he get you more than 50 yards in a score? There was a trend of that earlier in the season, and that trend has long disappeared. So for me, I have him not as a bench, but certainly as a player that you only turn to if you've really got no other options, but I think you do if you've made it this far in the season. And Amir Abdullah, I like in a 14 or 16 team league as a flex play. They have an awful rush defense. And Amir Abdullah, if he gets his usual 15 carries, I think 10 to 15 carries, I think he can make some noise and even break one out. So if you're up for taking a little bit of a risk, I think Abdullah's worth the roll. Saints win it all.
All right, and there you have it, folks. That is the Week 15 starts and sits reports as dictated to you by the Fantasy Geek himself. Head over to thefantasygreek.com and get signed up for the Skybox. It'll reap you benefits for the final 2 weeks of your season if you're really serious about winning your league. And make sure to stay tuned with all the off-season news and notes if you are out of your league. It is a wealth of information there. As for Late Night Sports Radio, tomorrow we are back with the Johnny Bobo Show at 10 p.m. Eastern Time, right at Late Night Sports Radio. Have a great week, everybody, and may the odds be forever in your favor.
Turn out the lights, the party's over.